Just a quick introduction about what JROFA is. JROFA is a nonprofit that serves military vets, first responders, and their families. But we also serve other people, but we do discounted services. And so all this kind of stuff, the free trainings and all of that's all for the community, because we're all about bringing people into healing when they have trauma. Whether it's individually or in your marriage or with kids, everybody has a degree of trauma. So what we really want to do with these tri-healings is basically educate the community on what trauma is. More than anything, how God designed the body and the brain to work, how trauma disrupts that process, and then how to help come alongside those who are trying to heal. Me personally, a little bit about me. I've got over 25 years of trauma experience, rape, neglect, abandonment, abuse, you name it, and I've been through it. I was diagnosed with complex PTSD when I was 19 years old. And then trauma got really bad in my marriage after that. I was involved in a cult, in a church, a bunch of other stuff. So I spent a lot of time on counselors' couches, but the thing that really brought healing for me personally was a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And then walking out that relationship with him, as well as other people, as well as the tools and practicality of the healing process with what happens when you do trauma healing. So basically what I did is I took all of the stuff that I learned in my own healing process, and now I'd say I'm about 95% symptom free of any kind of trauma. So the hypervigilance, all the stuff you're going to learn about in here is pretty much gone from my experience. And so with these trainings, I'm training the community how to come alongside those who have been through trauma so they can stop the traumatic experience and the after effects of it. You can't stop the trauma experience itself, but trauma happens in twofold: one, the event, and then the response after the event. So if the community can learn how to come alongside people better, it'll significantly decrease the diagnosis of PTSD, complex PTSD, et cetera. So that's kind of the heart behind doing these programs. But we're going to dive right in since we're a couple minutes late. The first class we have here is God, Trauma, and the Brain. Stuff you're going to learn, how God designed the brain to work, how trauma impacts the brain, and how you can help the healing process. So this course will go about an hour long, and then we'll take about a 5-minute break and come back for the second half. So this picture, this was taken at an actual event not too long ago. And I'm curious, any idea where this event was taken? It's not one of those super famous photos, but this was actually taken at 9/11, right? And so the feelings on this page, there's all sorts of emotions happening, right? And what a lot of people tend to think is, well, wait a minute, they're a firefighter, they're a police officer, they're a whatever, they've been trained. They shouldn't be impacted quite like this, right? You think they knew what they were getting into. If you're going to go fight a fire, or you're going to be pulling people out of cars, or you're going to be scraping people off the sidewalk, or you should have some kind of training or knowledge or understanding of trauma, and should it really affect you like this? And the truth is, nothing prepares you for trauma when you actually come to face it. Doesn't matter how many books you read, doesn't matter how many trainings you experience. When trauma goes off in the brain like a bomb, an individual can actually get trapped in that moment, and that moment will be stuck as they move forward, unless they do the things that are necessary in relationship with themselves, God, and others to really limit that impact. So we're going to take a look at what goes on in the brain in a moment like this, and we'll look at it in pretty good detail here. The brain operates kind of like a computer network. So this picture here shows those little bubbles. The bigger the bubble, the deeper that network, the more impact that topic has, right? And they're all connected. So an example of what this looks like, I'm going to do an illustration. Do you mind participating with me in an illustration? Okay, really quickly. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and it's going to be pretty much the same question. Just go with it and give the best answer you can. Okay. What color is this paper?
White.
What color?
White.
This page is what color?
White.
What color is this piece of paper?
White.
Are you sure it's white?
Yes.
It's white.
White.
What color is this paper?
White.
What color is it?
White.
This color is what color?
White.
It's a white piece of paper.
Yes.
Are you sure it's white?
Yes.
What color is this? One more time.
White.
What do cows drink?
Milk. Oh.
Exactly. What just happened is your brain dove into a network. White, 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 white. And in that network, it connected. I said, what do cows drink? Cow, milk, white. They drink milk, but they don't. They produce milk. They drink water. Exactly. And what's interesting is that when it comes to a trauma network, it's very similar to that. It's so deeply ingrained. Your brain will go with what is easy and seems truthful, not with what actually is truthful. So when someone experiences trauma, whether it's an incidental trauma, a specific event trauma, or whether it's relational trauma, the brain has to dig out of that network essentially and get into a place of truth as opposed to their perception of the experience. And I'll go into what happens in the brain and why they get stuck in this place of lies and deception and grief and all that kind of stuff, and how basically they drag themselves out, or we help them come out of it. But that's an example of how the brain dives into a network and gets stuck. So thank you for that. That was perfect. All right. We're going to look at how God designed the brain to work. Okay. This is a typical normal brain function. The brain is basically broken down into 3 sections. And those sections, they're all interwoven together. It's not so compartmentalized to say this is this box and this box and this box. They're very much woven together, but this is a pretty simple breakdown. First and foremost, you have your brainstem. And imagine if you're looking at my hand, this is kind of how it looks. You can explain it to kids and stuff really easily this way. The brainstem asks the question, am I safe? Deep in the center of the brain is your limbic system. And in that limbic system, it's asking the question, am I loved? Wrapped around all of those is your neocortex. And at the very front of that is the prefrontal cortex, which asks the question, what can I learn? Now, what's very important to remember is that this is a hierarchical system. If the brain does not feel safe, it's going to struggle to feel loved. If the brain does not feel safe and loved, it's going to struggle to learn. Okay, and I'm going to break this down even further. This is your brain stem. And even though it's the stem, it actually sits in the very center of the brain and comes straight down into the spinal cord. And with this, once again, the question is, am I safe? Very simple breakdown of what the brain stem does. That brainstem, that midbrain there at the that little blue section you see on the screen, that one's responsible for motor learning, motor control, emotional behaviors, that sort of thing. Okay, so for instance, when a cop is learning how to shoot a gun, when he's actually on scene, it's very different than learning to shoot a gun on range. Right? So his body is going to position itself differently. It's going to be awkward. It's not because he didn't go through training. It's that because training in a range is very different than standing behind your door when you're actually getting shot at. Right? So it's going to be a little bit awkward. He's going to fumble. Does that mean he didn't pay attention in training? No, he did. That's one of the reasons why they do those different mock experiences, to eliminate that learning process when they're actually in a real live fire. The pons is the middle section, that reddish section. That one handles motor function like eye movement, chewing, swallowing, tear production, facial expressions, that kind of thing. And with that, let's say a fireman comes home and he's had a really rough day, had a really bad fire. One of his buddies got really hurt. And he comes home and his wife says, how was work? And he goes, fine. But his facial expression says something very different. The words that came out were his prefrontal cortex, where language operates. The facial expression came from the brainstem. It's just a reaction based on safety or not safe. So if he's going to have that grieving, angry, trying to figure things out sort of expression, it's not that he's trying to be a jerk or that he's trying to lie when he says the word fine. They're not connecting because they're 2 separate parts of the brain that are operating. Does that make sense? Okay. The medulla oblongata, which is super fun to say, but is pretty simple. It's basically where the spine connects to the spinal cord. This is really crucial when it comes to blood flow, oxygen levels to the brain, all of that kind of stuff. This is also one of the reasons why when people can shoot themselves in the head and survive, they didn't sever the brainstem, right? That's one of the reasons why that happens. It's also responsible for reflexive actions like swallowing, coughing, vomiting, that sort of thing. Once again, this whole brainstem is asking, am I safe? Now, notice nothing in here was about logic, reason, none of that, right? This is all entirely separate. One way to simplify this, it's responsible for autonomous functions, that kind of thing. The next one here, the limbic system, is responsible for that question, answering that question, am I loved? Now, on this picture, you'll see a bunch of blacked out spots. There's a ton of activity happening in the limbic system. We're not going to talk about it all, but we're going to talk about some of them. Now, this whole system, it basically takes really complex structures and like thought, motivation, that sort of thing, and then connects them with more basic functions like emotion. So you're basically saying your high mental functions and your basic functions all come together here to operate, to see how the brain is going to tell the body to function. One thing it also is responsible for is reward versus punishment and the learning process. So for instance, if I do something and I realize I got a good response out of that, like I got a smile, I'm going to be more likely to do that. If I got a frown, I'm going to be less likely. That learning process is all happening in the limbic system. Okay. So one thing we're going to look at here is the thalamus, which you noticed because it's all connected. It's also at the very top of the brainstem, but they put it in the limbic system because it's right here, smack in the center, that little pink circle there. Now, the thalamus is basically like a sensory way station for the brain. So your sight, your smell, all the senses, actually not smell, your sight, your hearing, your touch, all goes into the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends it out in another direction. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. The next one we're going to look at is your amygdala. Now, the amygdala looks like a little almond-shaped thing here at the bottom, and the green circle around it. That one is basically a smoke alarm for the brain. And that's asking the question, am I safe or am I not safe? Is this going to kill us or is it not going to kill us? Okay. So again, the brainstem and the limbic system, they're not two separate things. They're intimately woven together, but the amygdala is also responsible for your it's the seat of your emotions. We'll get into that in a little bit, but that's largely the part of the limbic system that has a learning based on reward or punishment, is this amygdala. And I'll illustrate this in a second here. Your hippocampus, that long, stringy, pinky one right there, is where you have your memory stored. It's like a giant filing cabinet for all of your memories. Then you have over here and up above that cingulate gyrus or gyrus, however you want to pronounce it. And that OB there, those are your olfactory bulbs. Now, what this is your olfactory bulbs link smell to pleasant memories of previous emotions, and it actually participates in the emotional reaction to circumstances. So for instance, the smell of fresh cut grass, it automatically is like, oh, that smells so good. Why? It's fresh cut grass. The emotion that's tied to that smell is linked to your olfactory bulbs. So that's where that sense comes in. It's also, smell is the sharpest sense that links us to our trauma responses. So it's one that'll go 0 to 60 really quick when it comes to having a trauma response because of smell. Everything else has to go through the way station of the rest of the brain. The olfactory bulbs go straight to the amygdala. All right, so what does this look like? I'm going to, actually, we're not going to do that yet. We're going to go with the last part of the brain here, which is your prefrontal cortex. Now, I love this picture because I love learning about how the different parts of the brain work, and there's all sorts of different stuff to it. But that frontal lobe there is what's responsible for language, logic, reason, judgment, emotional expression, creativity, that kind of stuff. So all these other things are just fun little parts of the brain as to why, when someone struggles with, let's say, when they go through trauma, some people have a hard time with hearing sensitivity. It's one of those things that's super sharp. And you'll see in the next picture here, where the hearing is right on top of that limbic system structure. So that can be really closely connected, as well as sight. People who go through trauma sometimes have a light sensitivity. It has nothing to do with the trauma they experience, but they tend to wear sunglasses. Their pupils don't dilate like they should in response to light. Also typically tends to be a trauma response. So that's another training for another day. I would love to dive into it, but a little more deeper than we can go to today. What we are going to look at, hey, this is my favorite part. I get the color. This is your brain. So this is how this is supposed to work. You got your brain and you've got, I have no Picasso, so just roll with me on this. You've got your thalamus. I'm going to take this off so I can draw a little bit easier. You've got your amygdala, and you've got your hippocampus, okay? So the thalamus is, again, sensory input. The amygdala is your smoke alarm. The hippocampus is your memory. And your prefrontal cortex up here is responsible for language, logic, and reason, and more, but again, simplifying. Your limbic system, am I loved? And your brainstem, am I safe? And of course, this part, what can I learn? Okay, now here's what happens. This is a normal response when you experience trauma. Let's say A fireman gets a call and there's a house fire. They don't know what they're going to find, but they get a house fire call. So they go and automatically, when they show up, their thalamus, they see a house. Okay. They go inside the house, they go into the kitchen, they see there's a stove fire, or not a stove fire, an oven fire. Okay. There's smoke coming out of it, but there's fires confined to the stove. So then the amygdala, they sees it, receives the information. Is this going to kill us? Is it not going to kill us? It sends that information fast like a bullet to the hippocampus, then slow like a lazy river up into the prefrontal cortex. Now, when the hippocampus gets the image of a stove fire or an oven fire, goes to its little filing cabinet, pulls out a picture. The way the hippocampus works is it is constantly taking pictures and putting timestamps on it. So if I were to ask you, what'd you have for breakfast? You would remember a picture of eating breakfast and about what time you had breakfast, right? It's not a video, it's like a picture and a picture and a picture. So the hippocampus would pull out a picture of either training or an actual experience of a stove fire, I keep doing that, an oven fire, sends that picture back to the amygdala. And because of training, because of knowing the dangers and everything of an oven fire, it's not going to kill us. We know what, if we do what we're supposed to do, it's not going to kill us, right? Amygdala says, great. By then, the prefrontal cortex has received the information and the fireman goes through the process of putting out a stove fire, turns off the stove, opens the windows, throws some, extinguisher on it if he needs to, problem's taken care of, right? Training tends to override some trauma responses. That would be an example of how that would work. Now, let's say that same fireman goes to another call. And at that call, another house fire. They show up to the house fire and the fireman sees the whole house is engulfed in flames on the main floor. There's a woman lying on the lawn and she's passed out and there's smoke coming out of the top windows, black thick smoke, and they know it's about ready to go down. And as he's there, he runs outside and he hears a dog barking inside and the screams of a child. He hears that and sees that. The amygdala receives that information, sends it fast like a bullet to the hippocampus, and slow like a lazy river up to the prefrontal cortex. Now, by that time, the hippocampus looks through the memory bank. He may have seen a fire like this before, may not have, but he will see and remember the training that he's had. Sends a picture back to the amygdala, and when the amygdala gets it, in that situation, even with the most trained and experienced sometimes, what can happen is the amygdala says, trauma response, danger, Will Robinson, danger, basically, right? And when that happens, several things kick in. First, the amygdala hits that big red button. And what that does is it cuts off connection to the prefrontal cortex. And in that space, this part of the brain basically goes dark. Now, sometimes training can override this, sometimes not. But in this particular case, let's say it's his first fire, he's never done this before. And the front part of the brain goes dark, which means language, logic, reason, nothing happens. And instead, the limbic system and the brainstem take over for the sake of survival. Not just his survival, but the survival of that kid that's in that fire, right? And then those little dots around that the hippocampus there, that's cortisol. And once that prefrontal cortex goes dark, that's when flight, fight, there's another one, let's see if you know it, and freeze kick in. Do you know what that third one is? It's not as commonly known, and it's called fawn. Now, typically this tends to be the order that the brain very quickly goes through, but again, the prefrontal cortex is not choosing which order, right? It's simply going through what it knows is the best thing to do at the time. So flight, fight, fawn, or freeze, we'll dive into that in a minute. Cortisol surrounding the hippocampus then floods the hippocampus. It works with adrenaline to get the body to do what it needs to do. Adrenaline floods the system, cortisol floods the system, all the blood, not all the blood, but a lot of blood goes to the major muscle groups, pumps full of energy and all that stuff. So then the body can do the impossible, like lift a car off of a child or run much faster than they ever could. The point of this response is supposed to last about 45 to 60 seconds to get the body into a safe place, whether to run, to fight, whatever. In this case, he's a fireman and his instinct is to fight. to fight to get that kid, not to run away from the fire, but to fight to be able to save that child. So he runs to the fire. He gets inside. It's even worse than he thought it was. And then sure enough, the floor goes out and he can't get to this kid, and he runs out and the child dies. In that situation, cortisol, when it floods the hippocampus keeps taking pictures the whole time. But now sometimes because of cortisol in the system, it's kind of like trying to drive your car through a river. It'll drive, but it ain't going to operate very well. And so then what happens is as it takes pictures, and because the system is largely operating in this limbic space and it's not recording things properly, they'll get a hyper focus, like the stairs that are covered in smoke and or the darkness he can't see, or just the sound of the scream, or the fire in his face, but he can't see the typical things he might see in a situation like that. And then the timestamp is removed. So what happens is when he comes out of that fire, adrenaline's pumping, he thinks he's okay. I mean, he's shattered that he couldn't save that kid, but he keeps doing the job because that's the training. Eventually, this all starts to fade, and then his brain gets back online. But what happened in that trauma moment gets stuck. And so then what happens is every time he hears a crying child, he hears it, it goes to the amygdala, goes to the hippocampus pulls out the last time he heard a crying child. It's connected to a trauma moment, a fight or flight moment, sends it back to the amygdala, and because there's no timestamp, now the hippocampus is telling the amygdala that crying child that you're hearing right now is attached to a trauma moment, like the crying child from the fire. And so then he hears a crying child and he loses it. His heart starts racing. He starts sweating. He doesn't know what's going on. He's looking around for the kid that's really in danger when he's simply at a park with his wife and kids, and it's someone else's kid who's crying because they got pushed down. But he starts having a panic attack because his hippocampus is not connecting that memory of that sound of a child crying is from the past. It's not happening now. Does that make sense? So that's what happens when the brain experiences a trauma and it gets stuck. So the original design was the initial situation, right? We hear it, we see it, we go through it, we take care of it, we move on. With the trauma response, however, that's where memories get stuck. And so people say, well, great, the amygdala hijack happened. It's something they like to call it, amygdala hijack. And so it's constantly pushing that big red button of danger, Will Robinson, danger, and constantly going into this trigger response. So they try to address the amygdala, but the thing that people need to address is the hippocampus, creating new memories. So for instance, say that fireman is at a park and then the child has a breakdown, he hears crying, his wife can come alongside him and say, hey, honey, it's okay. That was from back then. This is now. Look at him. He's okay. He just got pushed down. Just look at that kid. Don't close your eyes because you're going to see the memory of that trauma, right? Just look at the kid. He's okay. That was then. This is now. I'm right here with you. I got you. You know, those kinds of statements. And we'll go into that in the next class. Any questions about this? Okay. All right. So on a nervous system level, the body stores trauma just like the brain does. It's two separate organisms, right? Your brain is an organ, your skin is an organ, the cells in all these things are separate organs, and they all store trauma differently. Bessel van der Kolk wrote an amazing book called When the Body Keeps the Score. He's got tons of free trainings online. He's a German guy. He's fun to listen to. But if you want to read more about that, it's a really great book. And basically what happens is in the system is when trauma happens, the brain asks, can I run from this? And if the answer is nope, okay, well, can I fight this? The answer is nope. Then typically the next response is to fawn. And this illustration is pretty cool. I got this from NICABM, but fawn is not on here. You see fawn most often in domestic violence situations where the wife comes home and she can't run from him. She can't fight him, but maybe she can deny her own needs to be able to get him taken care of, and then she'll be safe. So it's that sense of he's home, he's angry, he's had a bad day, or not even a bad day. He just wants to control her and he's angry with her and he's hurting her. She will deny every need she has, won't ask for anything just to pacify him so she's safe. That's a trauma responsive fawn. And then freeze, you typically see in children or rape victims. They're overpowered and you wonder why. Why didn't you cry for help? Why didn't you say something? Freeze took over. And with freeze, your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system are equally online. Parasympathetic, where you're alert, and sympathetic, you're just relaxed. It's just, you got to be in one or the other typically. But with freeze, they're both actively in place. And so you're literally, like in one example, someone showed me, hi, come on in. One example someone gave was, she was out in Kansas City, and there are massive spiders in Kansas City, and no one told her. She comes out of her apartment and she sees this giant tarantula running toward her. And she goes to slam her apartment door so this tarantula doesn't get inside, and it gets to the threshold, jumps, and lands on her open-toed sandal. And and she just went, she's like, I think I stood there for 3 to 5 years. I don't know how long I stood there. And the problem with that, what happened is that her brain suddenly went into a loss of time, because again, hippocampus taking pictures, no timestamp. It's like, how long have I been here? And inside she's thinking, run, run, spider on your foot, run, do something. But her body just couldn't, it froze. She was stuck. And it took a while before her system came back online and the spider slowly walked away and she was able to and move on. That's an example of freeze. We just get stuck. We can't fight, we can't run, we can't persuade, we just freeze, hoping it'll go away. And then the final one is actually collapse, where the person will literally faint. I had a client once when I was a trauma counselor at a different organization, and she had been under so much pressure, and fawn, that at one point she was pushed a little bit too far and literally passed out on the hospital floor. Like, she has no idea why she passed out, but this is what happened in her nervous system. Okay, so from here, the following information is basically going to help you to identify when someone you're working with or someone that you know who's a first responder is basically operating in a trauma response. It's really simple to see, and it's sometimes hard to discern. Are you just being a jerk? Are you just, what's your deal? Or is it related to trauma? I will tell you, most people who respond in these ways, it's not a conscious thing. It's something they feel they have to do. So I'm going to illustrate what this looks like here. And not just for the people you know, but it might be something that you find yourself doing as well. So flee, what does this look like? Pretty much what you think it would, right? They walk out of a room, they get busy, they serve. Women in particular are very good about running away by serving. So if you notice a woman at a public situation, she's feeling uncomfortable and she wants to leave, but she doesn't feel like she can leave, she'll start doing the dishes. She'll start picking up stuff. She'll start getting busy with other things so she doesn't have to engage. She's running away from engagement to serve. Now, is that always the case? No. But if you see someone looking uncomfortable and they start getting busy, that's a form of flee, if that makes sense. And then emotionally, denying feelings, calling them something else. We say, I'm not mad, I'm just frustrated. They're running away from that, from the sincerity, from the reality of feeling mad. And spiritually, I address spiritually here because everybody has some kind of relationship or understanding of either God or a deity of some kind. If they're abandoning that, not wanting to talk about God, not wanting to pray, not wanting to get into the word, there's a degree of running that they're feeling from this deity that they believe in, whether it's God or anybody else. So it's like, what do you do? If you see this, what's a way to respond? We can't force people to stay, right? One of the things about trauma is this sense of feeling like you have no choice. I'm stuck. There's no choice. If I leave, I will die. If I stay, I will die. I'm stuck. My only response is my survival response. And again, that's not a logical thinking, because that part of the brain is not making that choice. That's the limbic system making that choice. But with it, what do? If you notice someone who recently went through a trauma, or has experienced trauma in the past, and these are some of the behaviors that you see on a regular basis. First and foremost, identify the flee before they actually flee. An example of this would be if you're having a hard conversation with someone and they start backing away from you in the conversation. They're still having the conversation, but they're taking steps away from you. That's an example of, I am not feeling comfortable or safe, emotionally, mentally, whatever. I'm taking steps away to put a little distance. It's an example of flee before they actually start going. Another one would be if you're having a conversation, they start doing the dishes, or they pick up a video game, or in the office space, for instance, they're having a conversation, then they start moving things around on their desk, or they start, I gotta make a phone call. They're making those adjustments, right? To call it out without putting them on the spot, simple question like, hey, is this a good time to have this conversation, or do you want to do this later? Doesn't put them on the spot to say, I notice you're running away right now. Yeah. In some relationships, you can do that, right? But in a professional situation, especially with first responders, Most first responders, I will tell you, take a lot of pride in what they do. I don't know one that doesn't. They love to do it. They love knowing that they can do it. They've had the training to do it. And to think that something they've signed up to do has caused them to experience pain, suffering, and trauma can give them this false impression that they're failing at what they love to do. So to address that, it looks like you're running away, may give them this impression that, no, I can still do my job. I can do my job. And that's not at all what you're saying, right? So giving them a way to address the running without addressing the running is, hey, is this a good time to have this conversation, or do you want to do this later? It gives them a choice of being able to leave, right? But it left in relationship as opposed to just running away. And then you are also the one who gave them the opportunity to leave. You're not trapping them in the conversation. You're not forcing them to stay. It's, is this now a good time, or do you want to do this later? It's a simple way to do that. And sometimes it is safe to call it out when you notice, hey, I'm noticing, calling out what it is. I notice you're starting to do the dishes. Do you not want to have this conversation? It's a little more intentional way of calling it out, or something as simple as, hey, you know, you're denying your feelings a little bit here. You're saying you're fine, but this is what I'm seeing you do. It's okay that you're sad. It's okay that you're hurt. Just gently bringing it back without saying you are hurt, you are sad, obviously, right? One other area too, if you notice they're running away and they're not denying it, they're genuinely running away, get them grounded. And a simple way to do that is, hey, look, can you just tell me for a second, can you look at your hands? What are your hands doing? Sometimes they're shaking, sometimes they're clenched, sometimes they're busy. Just look at your hands. Can you just look at your hands for a minute and get them connected to their body again, as opposed to stuck, wrapped up in their head. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase, feel into your body. People who have gone through trauma have no freaking clue what that means. Unless they've gone through some pretty severe counseling, feeling into their body feels terrifying because their body doesn't feel safe in that moment. But just look at your hands. You just put your hands on your knees. Can you just rub your hands together for a minute? It gets their attention into a physical space, into the present. Fight. This one's pretty obvious as well. Physically hitting, striking, pushing, shoving, slamming doors, breaking items. That's a physical fight. Emotional fight, name calling, outbursts, right? Seeing one emotion and hearing another, such as you're frowning because you're confused about what's going on and they think you're ticked off at, right? They take any emotion, even tears. Now you're trying to manipulate me as an aggression from you to them. And that's not necessarily the case at all. Attacking others, verbally, physically, whatever. And then spirituality as well, spiritually, raging at God, or any kind of spiritual support whatsoever. I will never say nobody should ever get angry at God. By all means, get angry at God. He can take it. He knows your real feelings, so be angry. But if you notice, when someone who typically has a relationship with God is just very angry at God, there's a degree of fight against their circumstances and what they've been experiencing. Not to say these are things you don't have to say, don't do that. You're not supposed to do that. That's not the point. The point is to recognize that this is a trauma response and that whatever the circumstance is in the moment just triggered a memory of some kind from that previous trauma. Could be an emotional trigger, could be a physical trigger, could be whatever, but they got triggered. So the reaction is less about the current situation and more about what that current situation, how that current situation is connected to the past. Okay. And once again, the biggest thing, like with the flee, you're focusing on safety, giving them a chance to get out. With fight, same thing, focus on safety. Is now a good time to have this conversation, or do you want to do this later? Guarantee you almost every time, no, now's not a good time. Okay, no problem. We'll do this later. I'll touch back later. You stay calm. When people are angry and they're raging and they're raising their voice, one of the best things you can do, lower yours. Right? When you get into a tit for tat and who can yell louder, who can be best heard, you lose, both of you lose, and you don't connect, and then you just broken trust. But if they're getting louder and you get quieter, and it's hey, we don't have to do this right now if you want to do this later, or I notice you're getting a little bit louder, so how about we just come back to this another time? Or their behavior, they're slamming doors, they're getting, clenching their fists, whatever. Noticing those times before they get to the slamming doors or screaming or striking and hitting, usually you'll see things like a clenched jaw, clenched fists, right? This sort of thing, right? Or you'll see a pacing even, like they got this, I got to do something and I don't want to do it, so I'm not going to do it. Noticing those subtle types of things, a furrowed brow, that kind of stuff can be a sign, especially if you know they're prone to angry outbursts, to acknowledge, okay, they're heading in that direction. I can stop this by disengaging from the conversation. You know, how about we just talk about this another time? I'll come back when you're less busy. Or simply calling it out. You know, hey, I noticed you're getting a little angry. If you're in a place to walk them through it, I would not recommend starting with telling them to breathe, because it's so cliche. The typical response is, I am breathing. Okay, that's fine. I'm glad you're breathing. Good. Sometimes a simple thing is, hey, I noticed your hands are clenched. Can you just open your hands for me? It's really hard to be angry when your hands are open. It's really hard if their arms are crossed to be angry when they drop their arms. Because if you think about it, this is imposing. And this is also covering what? Your vital organs, right? It's protective. This is getting ready for a fight, whether they realize it or not. They're getting ready to defend themselves. Even though their fists might not be up, they're down and they're ready to go. Or the hands on the hips thing, right? The imposing, I am bigger and I am stronger. That's not necessarily what they're intentionally thinking of, right? Their body, again, going back to the way the brain works, is just starting to react based on whether or not they feel safe, loved, etc. So looking at those behaviors and saying, hey, can you just put your arms down for a second? Because you look like you're a little bit scary right now. You know, sometimes just calling it out and smiling about it can disengage. Additionally, we sometimes, because we get afraid of these angry outbursts, can also position ourselves in a defensive way. We can cross our arms. We can put our hands on our hips. We can start doing this thing. What is this doing? Once again, protecting the vital organs, protecting the neck, protecting the stomach. You know, we can turn away a little bit. We can just we can put ourselves in that position. Sitting down will always make you less of a threat in someone's eyes. When you're standing up with them, it's almost like you're facing off unintentionally. The position you have in that space is really important. If they're sitting at their desk and you walk in to have a conversation and you see them starting to get angry and you're standing, sit down. Puts you both on a level playing field. Whoever's taller tends to be in a place of authority or in a place of a threat. If you're both sitting down, standing up and walking away, or sitting back. If you're sitting back, you're less of a threat than if you're leaning forward. This is more intentional, right? This is, we're just here having a conversation. Open arms versus closed. All those little tiny things will communicate, hey, we don't have to continue down that path. All right. I didn't go into fawn on this because that's a little bit more than the time that we have. So we're going to jump right over to freeze. This one you will often see because for a couple of reasons, from first responders in particular, there is a message in their brain that I have to be able to do my job. I can't run and I can't fight, because both of those will make me look like I'm incompetent for my job, that I can't handle it, but I can freeze. And again, this is not a conscious thought. This is what the brain immediately goes to. Freeze, when it comes to physical, just like someone sitting still, zoning out. You kind of go, hello, McFly, anybody home? Right? And they're like, oh, what? No, I'm fine. You just think they're zoning out. Or here's one of my favorites, and I have my phone on me, but that's freeze. Scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. Video games can be a way of freezing, right? Nobody notices when you're just scrolling through your phone. Nobody notices when you're just zoning out. You had a long shift, you're tired, that makes sense. Most people don't realize that can be a functional state of freeze, okay? And then with that, emotionally, again, no emotional expression, stoicism, they're just not there. And it takes a little bit to get them back. And now, most people go through a stage of, we all zone out to a degree, right? Does that mean that we're in freeze? No. But if someone experienced a traumatic event and they're zoning out more often than normal, or they're just not present, you're having to get their attention a little more often than normal, they're checked out, again, scrolling, constantly watching TV, not wanting to have conversations, avoidant, I don't know, I'm fine. Non-committal, not even saying I'm good or I'm bad, but I'm fine. It's okay. These very even-keeled, how you're really doing. Fine is not an emotion. It's amazing how many people don't realize that. Fine is not an emotion. But same thing, what do? You get them to a place of safety. Sometimes a simple thing of when they're zoning out, hey, Jerry, you good? Huh? Yeah, no, yeah, I'm good. Sit down next to them on the couch. Sit in front of them, sit with them. Where was your head? I have no idea. I was just zoning out. Okay. How you been? Oh, I'm good. I'm fine. I'm fine. Starts kind of looking away, starts going into that running space, right? That fleeing space. Hey, if you want to talk, I'm happy to talk or happy to listen. No, I'm good. Okay. Sometimes in that moment, it's like, okay, you just made a connection. The next time you see him zoning out, just sit next to him. No words. And when they see that you're just with them in that freeze, sometimes the situation rises up, or man, I just keep doing that. When you keep showing up consistently, that you see them, it's an invitation for them to come out if and when they're ready. Sometimes freeze can just be a place of, I don't know how to start without all the feelings coming up. And so I'm just going to shut down. But if I see you're constantly there and you're not pushing, maybe I'll have a word that'll come out and it'll be like yeah, that was a rough one. I bet. Just be with them wherever they're able to be. Does that make sense? That poking, prodding, pushing. And one of the biggest things always is we don't have to have this conversation right now. We can do this another time. Would you like to talk about this later? Okay, I'll come back and check in with you a few hours from now, or I'll come back and check in with you tomorrow or next week. But always giving them that opportunity. Do you want to talk about this now, or would you rather talk about this later? Because again, when we go into a trauma response, we feel like we're trapped. When we as their community come alongside them and give them a choice, we can stay or we can keep going or we can go do something different. It gives them this space of choice in the midst of what feels like not having any choice, which again starts to rewire and create new memories. You're not trapped, not now, not in this moment, and not with me. Okay. All right. So what do we do when someone is in one of these responses? I gave you some practicality, but just to make it super clear, don't do this. Don't get in their face. Criticism, judgment, manipulation, all that kind of stuff, that doesn't work. So don't do that. What do? This. A gentleman on the left-hand side in particular, his hands are relaxed, fingers open, his hands are open, he's facing people squarely on, he is above them instead of, right there with them. But either way, everybody there has this position of, I'm open, I'm just here. I'm not in your face. I don't have an expression of judgment, criticism, anger. It's just, we're just having a conversation, focusing on connection, not correction. That's one of the biggest things. I'm not trying to correct you in your behavior. I'm just trying to connect with you in your behavior. I just want to meet you where you're at and hear where you're at and understand where you're at. So once again, people in trauma feel trapped and stuck and like nobody gets it. And if you're trying to correct me, you're trying to push me out of the place that I am. And trust me, if I could get out of this place, I absolutely would, but I can't. But if we go to connect, I'm just here, I'm listening. And we have the ability to say your behavior, your emotions has nothing to do with me. This isn't personal. It's not a personal attack against me. You're having a little car wreck over here, but it's not my car wreck. So I can watch you have this car wreck and I can hurt for you, but I don't have to be hurt by your car wrecks. It's not about me, right? So we call emotional boundaries. Very difficult, not easy, but with practice, it helps. How do we do this? To make the most of neuroplasticity. They say old dogs can't learn new tricks. That's why the picture's up there of a dog, which is a lie. They say, no, you absolutely, whether you're 73 or 17, you can learn, no problem. The brain has an amazing ability to learn no matter how old you are. And it's so funny because I'm like, well, the Bible's been telling this for a very long time, right? As a man thinks, so is he, and be renewed in the pattern of your thinking. All of those things the Bible's been telling us for a very long time. Science is like, oh yeah, that's right. Okay, neuroplasticity, that's what we'll call it. So activity and engagement can actually empower people when they're in that trauma response crisis. For instance, if they're struggling to learn, go back to safety. Go back to your relationship with them. Is there safety in your relationship with them? So for instance, let's say you've got a cop who is trying to learn how to just re-engage with his brothers and sisters, right, on the force. And he's struggling because he lost someone in his previous unit. His partner was killed, let's say. Does not want to connect with anybody, rather do it alone because he's not going to lose anybody again. He connects with you. Let's say you show up as a chaplain and he connects with you because he's supposed to before he can actually go out with a partner. All right, he's connecting with you. The neuroplasticity part, he's learning how to do relationship with you and that relationship between police and chaplain, which will transfer into his new relationship between him and his new partner. So again, it's not about correction, but about connection. As you're connecting with him, that will help his brain to relearn how to do relationship with a new partner. Doesn't have to be about, let me give you these tools and these steps and these whatever. I'm just going to talk to you like a human being, remind you what that's like. And I'm going to keep pushing into connection with you to remind your brain and teach your brain what it's like, how to have connection, how to maintain connection. And even you're not going to realize this is happening, but your brain's going to learn, and the reward from that connection, those chemical releases are going to happen. And you're going to be a little more likely to take that risk with your partner that you wouldn't have taken before because you learned it in relationship with me as your chaplain. And kind of see how that connection can happen. So it doesn't matter how much trauma they've been through, it doesn't matter how old they are, the brain will always be able to learn new things, but it needs safety and it needs love. And don't make it weird. If I care about you, there's a degree of love I have for you, right? So with that, how do we get the brain back? Sometimes people go into that trauma response, it's like talking to a brick wall. Why? Because that prefrontal cortex is pretty much cut off. It's all black. And so they're operating out of their limbic system. One way to do it is diaphragm breathing. And what this means is we tend to breathe with our chest or we breathe with our diaphragm. And if we're breathing with our chest, it's kind of, we're breathing with our diaphragm. What happens is the diaphragm, when we breathe with our diaphragm, it drops because our lungs expand. And with that, it stimulates what we know as the vagus nerve. That vagus nerve is that yellow thing weaving all over the organs, okay? And what that does is when our diaphragm drops, it presses down on those internal organs, squishing them, which then stimulates this vagus nerve. Now, the vagus nerve is responsible for calming the organs after the stress response occurs. It communicates to the brain what's happening in the organs. So when you have a stomach ache, that vagus nerve is telling your brain there's something going on with the stomach. Okay, when you think there's something going on internally and you can't figure out what it is, but something is off, your vagus nerve is responsible for sending that information. So when you do some good deep breathing and that diaphragm drops and it presses down on those internal organs, the vagus nerve is stimulated in such a way that when we're stressed, we don't do some solid deep breathing. We tend to breathe really shallow, right? But if we tell our body, breathe, and we go do good deep breathing, and that diaphragm drops, pressing on those internal organs, stimulating that vagus nerve. The vagus nerve sends a message up to the brain, and it actually connects to the amygdala, and the body tells the brain, we're good down here. We're fine. So what ends up happening is you do some good, solid, deep breathing, stimulating that vagus nerve. Other ways you can stimulate that nerve, breathing through a straw, cold water on the face, all that kind of stuff makes you go, right? Or just that intentional deep breathing you have to through a straw. Those kinds of things will stimulate that vagus nerve. And when you do that, your amygdala freaking out because the hippocampus keeps sending it this faulty information with no timestamp. The amygdala is also hearing from the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is saying, we're good, we're fine, which then causes the amygdala to, oh, okay, we're fine. We're fine. Hippocampus, I don't know what you're doing, but the body's fine. So we're just going to go with that. So it's a way to tell your body how to talk to your brain. They call that a bottom-up approach in therapy. So let's say you've got someone who's, let's say, an EMT, and they just got off a job and they're hyperventilating. And they're like, I don't know, I can't. Like, for instance, a friend of mine, she actually responded to a call. She was worked with Life Flight, and she showed up, and there was a picture of someone who was killed by a drunk driver. This kid was riding his bike, and it was a mess, absolutely horrific, seeing this child on the street. And she started hyperventilating just because she could not process what was in front of her. And I don't think anybody can process something like that in front of them. And as she did that, she just went straight to the deep breathing. The diaphragm turned away, did what she was supposed to do. And by the time her brain came back online, within about a minute, her training kicked in. So it was the deep breathing where her body told her brain, we can do this. We can do this, we can do this. And it got it calmed down enough for her brain to get back online and go logic as well as emotion. Which, did she still struggle? Absolutely. But she wasn't completely offline. All right. Memory. There's two different kinds of memory, explicit and implicit. Explicit memory is the episodic memory, they call it, which is basically, where'd you go to high school? East Valley High School. Okay, that's your declarative episodic memory. Then you have your implicit memory, which is basically the memory that is How do you know how to brush your teeth? I don't know. I just did it. Right. That's a procedural memory. How do you know how to walk? How do you remember that? You just do. Procedural memory. Okay. With implicit memory, it's a subconscious memory. And when it comes to trauma, people are naturally pushing away from those things that they feel unsafe with, and they're drawn toward things that give them the perception of safety. Emphasis on perception. For instance, let's say you've got a cop who experienced something horrific on scene, and he goes to the bar. The perception of safety is I can numb out and not think about what's going on. Is that really going to give him safety? No, ultimately it's not. But he goes to the bar and drinks himself to death because he gets to forget, so to speak, the memory for a little bit when he doesn't have to feel. He's drawn toward the perception. He pushes away from talking about it because the pain that's associated, it feels unsafe. So that's an example. In addition to that, I've had situations where women are being questioned by police about, let's say, in fact, one that comes to mind, husband and wife had a son who basically disappeared, and they found him later. But when the cop came to talk to the parents about what happened to the son and what the relationship was like, the husband would put his arm around his wife and almost like seeming like he's comforting her. Everything in her, this cop said, she was leaning away. She kind of had her arms crossed. I mean, all of her body language was saying, I do not feel safe. Kept glancing at him, and she would try to kind of readjust and not make it obvious, but her body was trying to say, I don't feel safe with my husband, which immediately told the cop there's something going on there. Her implicit memory is drawing away from her husband, not because he's not safe. So in that situation, sometimes you can think that just because someone's a cop, they're safe. It's not necessarily the truth. Just because someone's a fireman, they're safe. Not necessarily the truth. People are people are people. But paying attention to what are people drawn to and what do they push away from will give you an idea of where they feel like their safety lies. All right, giving trauma-sensitive assistance. We have to understand how God designed the brain to work and how trauma impacts the brain in order to come alongside people better. My phone is an Apple iPhone. If that phone breaks, where do I take it to get it fixed? You take it to Apple, right? Why would I not take it to just any old general store?
Specialized.
It is specialized, right? When something breaks, we take it to its creator. We are made, we are created. We're not just an accident, right? We're created. And when we break, we go to our creator. Okay, God, how did you design this to work? And when we know how the creator designed something to work, we can then partner with it and use it appropriately. So for instance, with the brain, when trauma is hitting the brain and you know there's these broken memories inside, we go to create new memories so the hippocampus has something new to draw from. For instance, with the trauma, when someone is experiencing, let's say, once again, the firefighter, let's use that example, and he can't go near a fire. He can't smell it. He can't do anything with it. Kind of makes him useless at his job, right? So doing things like, let's go back to training. We're going to create a new memory with smoke and fire and all those kinds of things. We're going to create new memories with screaming. Is it ever going to leave? No. But what you can do is help the hippocampus establish new memories with timestamps. So the next time you're near a fire and you hear a scream, you don't think about the child that died inside. You think about the person that was rescued. You think about your teammates. You think about the training experience, and your brain starts to recognize not every scream is a trauma scream. Not every scream is a trapped, hopeless, helpless scream. Now, with memory, there's no way he's going to want to draw toward that because it sounds terrifying. But that is where we as a community get to come alongside them, support them, encourage them, etc. But in doing so, we have to first accept the individual for where they're at. We cannot focus on fixing or correcting people. We have to accept them. They're not okay. They're struggling. They're in a really dark spot. If we try to say, you're fine, it's going to be okay, we do them a disservice because they're not fine, especially not in the moment when they do say, I'm not okay. Well, you're going to be okay. It'll be fine. It's not an acceptance of where they're at, right? We have to be willing to meet them where they're at. And with belief, one thing about healing from trauma, I will tell you, so many people think you can't be healed from trauma. I was told, you've been diagnosed with PTSD, you'll have this the rest of your life. You're diagnosed with complex PTSD, you'll have this the rest of your life. I'm like, well, that's depressing. Thank you very much. But One, scripture says that by Jesus' stripes, I am healed. Neuroplasticity, the Bible says my brain can be remade, can be learned all over again. And if I have all the things that I need in relationship with other people, and I exercise the things that are necessary to help my brain to relearn, to help my body to heal from its own memories, there's no reason why I can't heal from trauma. And I will tell you, as I said before, 95% of the symptoms that I had before are gone. My biggest symptoms are things like my body still has memories over things like nail guns, and I'll go into that trauma in a little while. And it goes into things like nightmares. Those are something my brain is still working through. But the hypervigilance, before I could never sit with my back to a door, into an open room, never in a million years. Now I don't even think about it, I just do. When it comes to relationships, I used to be terrified of people and I hated men with a passion. I'm not gonna trust men, are you kidding me? Now I have more relationships than I can count. It's extremely overwhelming and ridiculous, and I love it. I think it's wonderful. I used to have a big old screw you across my forehead. Now I'm like, hey, let's go have coffee. So all of these different kinds of things come with the healing process, but we have to believe that it's possible. It's not counseling that heals. It's not even us healing ourselves. God is the healer. And if we believe that and we partner with him, then he gets to do the miracles and the work that we can never do ourselves, that a counselor can't do on their own, and that the individual can't do on their own. It's partnering with the healer that makes healing that much more possible. That third one there, connection. Again, connection, not correction. We have to leave our agendas behind. As good intentioned as they are, that they heal, we unintentionally put timelines on the healing process. And we think, well, you should be healed by now. It's not how it works. There's healing God does in the heart while he's healing the brain and the body that need to happen in that process. And sometimes we think by now is on whose timeline? It's my timeline. And typically what that means is I'm uncomfortable with the duration of your pain. I want you to get better for my sake because I want to know that you're better. Walking away from a relationship or transitioning out of a relationship when they're still not healed, or they're still not in the place of healing you wish they were, is one of the hardest things. It's going to feel like we failed as a friend. We failed as a parent or as a husband or a wife or a lover. And that's not the case. Sometimes our place with someone on their healing journey is just for that time. And the healing actually happens when they transition to a new person who also helps them along the same way. Also helps people from stop being codependent on one person for their healing process. But connection is the key. Leave our agenda behind, just connect, meet them where they're at. And then deliver all the strength, love, the hope that you have inside of you, the resources that you have, whatever it is, all of those things contribute to helping someone to heal. If we just show up and we say, hey, I hope you feel better, and we move on, it's like, that's not helpful. But every person can listen. Every person can sit with someone and say, I see you, I hear you. And any trauma that happened relationally, we mostly talked about circumstantial trauma today, but relational trauma, you are the one person who can sit and listen and will sit and listen, and they've never had that before. That's an incredible resource to give. And that can heal a lot of pain when they're used to being dismissed or discarded or not listened to at all. And so the other part to this too with delivering is no one's expecting you to be the miraculous healer. No one's expecting you to do these amazing miracles. Showing up, being a safe person goes above and beyond what most people are actually expecting. So we're going to go into this next class here as it's going to go over communication, basically how to recognize nonverbal communication related to trauma and trauma responses in the body, as well as in spoken language and emotional responses, and how to bring someone to a place of safety. So we'll take about 5 minutes and then we'll dive into that next class. How to communicate well. That's the next class. Think, well, I know how to talk. That's great. That's not the point. We're going to communicate. Big difference. So really quick, 100% of communication, 7% is the words that you say. That's it. Another 93% is tone and body language. And people who are experiencing trauma, it's so interesting, the complete opposites you'll experience. Their words are saying one thing, but their tone of their body is saying something completely different. Always pay attention to the other 93% when in doubt. The other 93% will not lie to you like the other 7% will. And so in addition to that, when someone starts going off in a trauma response, or they're just reacting in a way that's connected to the trauma and not to what's, going on in the present, you'll learn how to bring them back to a place of safety. You don't have to run away. You don't have to do, the cop with the, stick. You don't have to beat them into submission. You can actually partner with them in coming into safety, even when they seem to not want your partnership at all. So this scene from the beginning that we looked at, this picture of this kid, I mean, he really is, he's a kid on 9/11, right? And he's a firefighter. And I imagine it's probably one of the first major things he ever experienced. And I can tell you, he probably did not ever dream he would be at that space in that time ever in his life. So in the future, he comes across someplace in New York, he comes across ash, he comes across the smell of fire, or he hears steel falling or whatever, and he's going to go right back to that space. What do you do when this is the man who breaks down at a simple house fire and it's a kitchen fire? And he can't go inside the building because of the smell of smoke, and he has a breakdown by the fire truck. What do you do? What do you do with the cop who can't handle any kind of confrontation because the last confrontation he was in, he got shot at and nearly got killed? How do you handle that situation when they just react immediately, whether in tears or in a fight, or they just freeze and they can't move? When we go through trauma, we tend to question our safety, and as a result, our lovability. In this space of the brain, all those networks and everything that are going on in the connection, we don't know what's safe anymore. We don't know who can be trusted. We don't know if we can be trusted. We tend to think things like, I'm too toxic for people around me. I'm only going to get someone hurt. I'm just going to be a damaging individual to everybody around me, or they're going to leave me, or they're going to fire me because I can't get my crap together. Insert explicit here, right? This, for the rest of the community, when they're in that space, this is where love comes in, and this is paramount. The love that you express to someone, you will model the love that they actually deserve to have, that you believe that they deserve to have. How you love them is telling them how you think they should love themselves. Basically, the love you know is the love you show. Now, this is where we're going to get a little bit more self-reflective here, a little bit more aware of how we view love. How do you view it? Kind of a rhetorical question, but do you see yourself as worthy of love? Do you see yourself as someone who is lovable? I mean, in scripture, God tells us, love others as you love yourself. We can't help that. We can only give what we have. And if we don't have love for ourselves, we can't give it to other people. It doesn't work. Or I should say, the love we have for ourselves is typically what we give to other people. It can often be very limiting. It can be very conditional. It can be to a certain point, and then I'm tired and I'm done. It can even be destructive. And sometimes for those who actually have that love for themselves that can and should come from God himself first and foremost, we can love with an unending, unconditional love that doesn't seem to make any sense when someone's looking at us or treating us in a way that's hurtful. A quick story. Let's say, as an example, you find out an EMT has been drinking on the job. You walk in and you find them in the storage closet saying they're going to get some toilet paper, and you walk in, you find themselves sipping out of a flask or chugging a flask. Your response is critical in that moment. I wanted to ask, would you say, hey, you are way out of line. You don't do that. You don't, what are you doing? Who are you? Or is your response, that is not okay. We don't do that. That's not acceptable. Is it a you approach, or is it a that approach? And it seems like a subtle difference, but it's significant, because on one end, you're looking at you, the individual, and on the other end, you're looking at the behavior. Okay, this is really critical to helping people heal from trauma, because once again, it goes back to safety and love, and then they're able to learn. So why does this matter? If I believe that the people around me, actually, let me back up even further. If I believe that I am only as lovable as I am well-behaved, I'm going to project that onto other people. As long as I'm good, I'm lovable, then, and anytime people around us are not good, we're going to treat them as though they're bad for what they're doing. The difference is, if I know that people are lovable, regardless of their behavior, that I'm lovable, regardless of my behavior, then I'm going to look at the behavior and not the person as the problem. We tracking? We can look at if we look at the person as the problem, that's where shame, condemnation, and a lack of safety and love come in. If we look at the situation or the behavior as the problem, then the person can actually feel safe and loved as they get help working on the behavior. Okay, subtle difference, but very significant. I'm going to look at some of the behavior things you might see as a response to, and this is either diagnosed or undiagnosed. I'm just going to go through the this list of quote symptoms here. I personally am not a huge fan of diagnoses because it's a labeling situation where people say, well, I can or I can't because I have or don't have, and they label. When we live according to a label, our identity is wrapped around complex PTSD, acute trauma, whatever, bipolar, I don't care what it is. When we attach ourselves to that label, we then limit ourselves according to what that label says we can or cannot do. If we treat people like people who have certain symptoms, certain behaviors, then there is no limitation. They can grow, they can heal, whatever. And we'll talk about identity a little bit in the future here, but let's look at the symptoms to start. Acute traumatic stress, this shows up between 3 and 30 days after the event, these symptoms. Any idea why it's not 0 to 30 days, why it's 3 to 30 days?
You're still in shock.
That's exactly right. Shock. 0 to 3 days, the first 1 or 2, sometimes 3 days, the brain is still going into what the heck happened. I don't know how to process what happened. And they get stuck, which is one of the reasons why when someone goes through a trauma, the most helpful thing we can do in the immediate, I'm not talking a couple of days, I'm talking immediate aftermath of a trauma, is to come alongside them, to hear them, to love them, to say, you're okay, I got you, we're going to get through this. The support that people can receive in the immediate aftermath of a trauma is critical to their healing process, because once again, their safety was threatened, their love was threatened, right? Trauma is the lack of choice. And if someone comes alongside them and says, we can get through this. Okay, you mean I have an option, right? The brain isn't processing this on a logical level, but that's what you're communicating. We have an option to get through this. We're not stuck here. Okay, so it's one of the most helpful things. But 3 to 30 days, you're going to see shock, confusion, depression, angry outbursts, right? And the physical symptoms are things like headaches, stomach aches, sensitivity to light and sound, those sorts of things. And concentration and memory problems, right? You've got a cop who comes back from a domestic violence situation. Even if nobody was killed, but it was still one of those terrifying standoffs. DVs are one of the hardest things to actually show up to. They're so unpredictable and so dangerous. And they go home to their spouse and they hear their spouse slam a door. Bam, they're right back there, right? You might walk around with a continual headache because he's trying to process what happened and he can't do it. He's just not sure how to do it. Or stomach aches. That vagus nerve, once again, is responsible for calming the organs after a stress response. If we're not working with the body, that vagus nerve is going to remain in this situation, that kind of a frozen space where it can't calm the organs like it's supposed to. So stomach aches, cramping, that kind of stuff, IBS, long-term trauma can cause those kinds of issues all the time. I will say that's another element of the trauma that I still work through on a physical level is that, the stomach issues, that kind of stuff, headaches, those sorts of things. The body takes a while to catch up to everything else. It's quite irritating, but still, it does catch up. Post-traumatic stress. These symptoms show up or persist more than 30 days after the event. These can persist for years, but typically aren't considered diagnosed until after these symptoms have been in place after the event, at least 30 days. That hypervigilance, zoning out. So for instance, the hypervigilance, they might have enjoyed going out with their buddies to have a drink and then go home. Now when they go out with their buddies to have a drink, they're going to pick a certain booth with a certain position where they can see the exit, they can see all the people inside, and they're probably only going to be able to handle it for a few minutes before they have to get up and go. They're too overstimulated, they're too hyper aware. I'm not going to go through all these for the sake of time, but some of these I want to point out. Poor self-management. They're going to do a lot of things without thinking. They're going to make a lot of decisions where you're like, you've been through, your training, you know this. Why are you doing it this way? Just not thinking. They're not managing themselves very well. When it comes to confrontation, they might be quicker to have an outburst, quicker to say something they don't mean. That's poor self-management. In addition to that, the avoidance. One key thing about avoidance of people, places, or things that remind them of the event. Avoidance does not necessarily look like a depressive, or depression, or I don't want to go there. Avoidance can sometimes look like the class clown who can't have a serious conversation, right? Hey, you want to go check, you want to go clean out, engine number 4? Ah, man, I clean out engine 4 all the time. I'm not cleaning out engine number 4. He's not cleaning out engine number 4 because engine number 4 was what he was on when he saw that fire. He ain't going near that thing, but he's going to make a joke about how he cleans all the trucks all the time. So he's going to go do something different. He's, above cleaning, let's say. That's one way avoidance can show up. In addition to that, that persistent negative emotional state, that when I say persistent is not just a few days or even a few weeks. I'm talking like weeks to months. They're not coming out of it. I'm not talking a roller coaster. I'm talking they're now tanked into this space where you can't bring them out. There's something going on, and it's not, talking to them is not working, or the typical routine is not working. They're in it. Okay. Complex PTSD. Now, complex post-traumatic stress, this is a little bit different than PTSD. PTSD is largely circumstantial, situational, an event happened. Complex is largely relational. So we're talking childhood trauma, rape, domestic violence, even medical trauma, someone who's had a terminal illness or has been battling, not even terminal, but battling an illness for years upon years. This is the kind of trauma where it's largely relational, and it's largely between an authority figure and they were the less than in the authority figure situation. So the more intimate the relationship, the more intense the trauma. For instance, a child who was raped by a neighbor is going to, for a period of time, a neighborhood babysitter is going to have trauma. Absolutely. A child who was perpetually raped by their father over a period of years is going to have a more complex level of trauma because the relationship is more intimate, right? The authority is different. Okay, and this complex post-traumatic stress is kind of like trying to untangle a million fishing lines that have been tangled up between 17 fishing boats over the course of 75 years. It's not a very simple breakdown, but I will tell you it wraps around largely identity, interrelational issues. Those are the primary separations between PTSD and complex PTSD. PTSD, you have the hypervigilance, the avoidance, all that kind of stuff. Complex is where you start getting into shame, a lack of identity, dissociation, that sort of thing. So it's a little bit of classification for you. So you have all the issues of PTSD with complex PTSD, but then you also have a lot of lack of memory. There's a lot of, I don't remember much of anything. A lot of my trauma happened as a child, and I don't remember much of anything before the age of 10. I have these little snippets, but it's mostly a black hole. And trauma, here's another little tidbit for those of you who are coming alongside first responders. There's a thing called dissociation, where they literally check out. It's like a black hole. They have no idea what happened, right? Dissociation is something children learn in formative years. It's not something that is learned as an adult. I don't remember because trauma in this state caused my hippocampus just to kind of go into this black hole space for 45 minutes. There's that. And then there's the dissociation where I have months, I have years that are gone. But children learn it as a form of coping when they're going through trauma, because they don't have the ability to fight. They don't have the ability to run. Their hippocampus and all the rest of their brain is still developing. And so they basically learn how to separate themselves from reality in some capacity. It's amazing what God has allowed the brain to do. And it's honestly, it was a gift from God so that they don't have to be fully present for the horrors that they experience as children. Now, what that means is if you have people who are first responders who have a way of dissociating, they don't connect, they don't remember, they do that on a regular basis, you're not just dealing with the trauma of an event as a police officer, as a deputy, as a fireman, you're also now dealing with the trauma from childhood that has been not dealt with. Now, I will tell you, with healing, as you're going through the healing process, if dissociation was a common thing for you to cope and to survive, as you heal from those traumas, you actually know your brain no longer feels a necessity to do it because you learn how to cope with, in a healthy way, the traumas you're facing now. But sometimes if you find out that, your people are like, I don't remember what happened. I was there and then I wasn't, or kind of had an out-of-body experience or what have you, it's likely there's an underlying childhood trauma that's not been dealt with, that's now being triggered by the trauma they're facing as a first responder. Does that make sense? Okay. So with this, you get avoided with the being persistent feelings of shame, that isolation, A lot of what you'll see is avoiding eye contact. They look or actually seem to be way too busy to have a conversation. Either they're hunched over and hiding, or they're just overconfident and you cannot approach them, right? You just can't have a conversation. They're always too busy. They always got something going on that you can't reach them. They won't actually do relationship. Reckless or self-destructive behavior. Adults self-harm just like kids do. We talk about cutting and all that kind of stuff as though it's just kids, just teenagers. No, adults do it too. And adults get a lot more creative. Like the guy who goes down into the basement, or I should say the Marine who went down into the basement of her training unit and punched a punching bag until her knuckles bled and did it over and over and over again. I'm just training. It's not self-harm. Yeah, right. Okay. Things like self-sabotaging behavior is another thing. They'll drink and they don't care that you show up in there in their uniform drinking. They'll, drive more recklessly than they really need to when they're chasing down a suspect, even if they're not. All right, those are the kinds of things that you'll see. And the physical symptoms, those get a little bit more worse. You see things like a chronic itching, which is an interesting thing. Just this, I have this constant itch. I just itch everywhere, like they got ants in their pants, literally, except all over their body. They just want to itch. Makes you wonder if they're on something, but they're really not. They just feel itchy. They get hives. They'll get, again, the headaches get worse, the migraines, stomach ulcers are a big one that'll show up. IBS, indigestion seems to be a continual thing. Their body is basically telling them, we can't keep holding on to this. Can we do something with it, please? Because the chemicals we release in our brain are actual chemicals, emotions, all of that, right? If we don't process those things, if we don't release them out of the body, our body will internalize them, and they have to do something with them. There was a study done a while ago. I read about an amazing book called When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor Mate. Amazing book. Lots of research if you like that stuff. And one of the studies they did was on 100 women who had breast cancer. Nobody knows what causes breast cancer. Nobody has a clue. And yet he was determined to see if he could find one thing women had in common who had breast cancer. So it was 100 women. He did all these studies, had psychologists and psychiatrists go through all these different things, ask scientific questions, family history questions, all these different things. One thing, they were all different cultures, by the way, too. One thing in common, the inability to say no. They were overly nice. And what that meant was that they would deny themselves their own feelings, their own needs, to take care of everybody else. So when they felt uncomfortable and they wanted to say no, they wouldn't. They would shove that down and they'd say yes. When they felt overworked, overwhelmed, all those things, they wouldn't say anything. They would just smile, shove it down, and do whatever needed to be done to take care of everybody else. Their own needs and emotions were unaddressed. And so the body internalized it. This is the theory, which caused breast cancer. That's what his conclusion was. Absolutely fascinating. A lot of things can be similar for people who have fibromyalgia and other autoimmune disorders. So the body will absorb it. And so when you start hearing people complain of these, I have no idea what's with my headaches lately. I have no idea why I'm just suddenly having all these things. Maybe you should go talk to somebody. I'm fine. Yeah, because your body is definitely telling you you're fine. Let me know when you're ready. Love to talk with you. Sometimes just making it light like that and just be like, it's not a big deal. Your body's trying to tell you something. How about we have a conversation? Okay. Nobody likes living that way, but some people choose to. And sometimes it just takes a while to heal too. Sometimes with complex PTSD, symptoms will stay very dormant for decades. It's amazing to me how many of my clients that I have seen who have complex PTSD, they come to me in their 50s and their 60s. Not in their 20s, 30s, 40s. You think that's when they would do it. But they are so busy going and being fine and managing themselves that finally their brain and their body gets to a point in their 50s and 60s, sometimes even in their 40s, where they can't anymore. They can't function, they can't work, their relationships are finally fed up and done, they're afraid, they're fried, and they're finally at a point of, I literally can't go on until I do something about this. And that's usually what ends up happening and why they end up coming. So sometimes these symptoms can stay dormant for a very long time, and all of a sudden, boom, their brain goes into this stage called, it was there and it was gone. It's almost like an idle stage. When you get to about 55 to 60, your brain goes into kind of an idling stage where it just kind of relaxes a little bit. And all the walls we had built up for 30, 40 years of trauma suddenly just drop. And it's like, I don't know what's going on. Well, your brain's telling you it's finally ready to work on stuff. So let's get started. So that's a little bit of complex PTSD. Things you're going to hear. Those are some things you're going to see. Here are some things that you're going to hear. On the emotional side, you'll hear things like, I'm just emotional, or sarcasm. Well, I guess I'm just broken. All right. Sarcasm is many people who's gone through trauma, it's their favorite love language. We're all broken, you seem a little broken. We're all broken. They brush it off. Right. Or I guess I'm just stupid. When they're not managing themselves well, when they're not handling things well. I guess I just don't do things well. I don't know what I'm going to do. That's a little more serious one. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't trust myself. That's another one. When you start hearing things like that, I don't trust myself. They're feeling a little out of control. Why can't I get over this? I don't feel anything. I'm numb. It's fine. Or here's my favorite. I got this. But obviously their behavior does not line up, right? Again, 7% of communication is words. Pay attention to the 93% and take the 7% into consideration. And then here's my favorite. It's whatever. Awesome. Let me know when it's something other than whatever. Behavioral, you'll see some of the behaviors we talked about: fight, flight, and freeze, slamming doors, making more noise as they move, like stomping through rooms, almost like they're trying to get attention, but they don't want attention, but they don't know how to ask for help. So they do something silly, passive aggressive like that. Raising their voice, sometimes straight silence. Lying, deception, apathy, like no care whatsoever in what they're doing. Again, that's kind of a functional state of freeze. Physical and psychosocial, once again, the body stuff. They start complaining of pain. None of the other stuff could be there. And they seem fine. But then you hear them in the break room. I just have this pain. I can't get it. I don't know what my deal is. And they just had something difficult happen. They're going through some really hard stuff at home. There's some trauma that's happening. Trauma, by the way, you can drown in 6 inches of water just as easily as you can drown in 6 feet of water. Trauma is largely subjective. What I might think of as no big deal could be someone else's absolute most traumatic time. Trauma is largely a threat to life or livelihood. So keep that in mind when it comes to, was that trauma or was it just a bad day? There's a big difference. But 6 inches of trauma is no better, no worse than 6 feet of trauma. It's just different depending on the person. And of course, nightmares, not sleeping well, insomnia, crying, yelling, and seems appropriate. Those are some other things that you're going to hear. What is beneath the surface of all of these things? You say, well, trauma is beneath the surface. Yeah, but what does that even mean? What's really going on? How am I, as a friend, as a coworker, going to connect when either I have no idea I don't know how to connect with trauma, or I know trauma, but my trauma is not their trauma, and I know what I needed, but it may not be what they needed. So what's underneath it all? How do I actually connect? Basically, in simplistic terms, it's grief. There's a sense of loss, longing, and feeling lost. There's a few quotes that I love about this with loss. It's by John Green. He wrote this book called The Fault in Our Stars. It's kind of a young adult book, but he has this amazing quote in it, and it says, "The pleasure of remembering had been taken from me because there was no longer anyone to remember with. It felt like losing your co-rememberer meant losing the memory itself, as if the things we'd done were less real and important than they had been hours before." And he's talking about, it's a female character who lost her best friend to cancer. And with that, though, some people as first responders are going to lose a partner, whether because they left the unit or because they were killed, or they left the unit and had to start out someplace new. But when you experience loss and you lose the people in your life as a result of trauma, there's this sense of feeling as though the actual memories that you shared with them are no longer here, and you can't get those back. Personal example, I recently had an experience where I was removed from a ministry that I had become so much like family for me. And it was this group of people, they were my world, they were my everything. I had holidays with them, I did all these things with them, and then circumstances came where I was basically removed from that into a place where I was no longer in relationship with them. And it's a very disorienting feeling of loss, because I had 5 years, 6 years of memories with all of these people. And now there was nobody to say, hey, remember that time when? There was no one to share a memory with. There was no one to ask, what was the name of that restaurant? Nobody's here to ask that question, which makes it seem as if the memories themselves are now no longer useful. What's the point of having memories at all? Which then is the temptation is to no longer connect with people, because if you lose them, the pain of losing them and the pain of losing the memories associated with them, way too overwhelming. Why bother? So in a first responder situation, losing people, why bother? Why bother reconnecting? Because they're just going to lose them. And that loss is too overwhelming. It's too difficult. It's too painful. One thing that was very helpful for me when processing this, and not just this situation, but times before that as well, is that one, going back to God's design, God is omnipresent. He's everywhere all the time. God cares about every single one of us. So no matter the memories that we feel like are lost, never are. We always have a co-rememberer because God is with us every step of the way. So those times of feeling like, what was the name of that? No, there's no one to ask. Well, yeah, there is. You just got to listen a little bit different, right? Or, man, remember, there's no one to remember with. Actually, yeah, God, remember that time? We always have one to remember with because God is a relational God in Jesus Christ. He's not a religion where you check a box and do and don't. It's a relationship. Longing. This quote comes from Brene Brown in her book, Rising Strong. She says, longing is an involuntary yearning for wholeness, for understanding, for meaning, for the opportunity to regain, or even simply touch what we've lost. When we go through trauma, trauma steals, kills, and destroys. The enemy steals, kills, and destroys. Trauma is just one of the ways that he does it. And when we lose things as a result of trauma, there's this yearning for wholeness. Trauma stole something away. There's this ache for something you can't identify. Sometimes there's a tangible thing that was lost. Sometimes death is that thing, and that person who died is the thing you lost. But most often, the loss is not just the individual. It's not just the town. It's not just the home. It's not just the family member. It's all of the intangibles. It's the tomorrows I'm never going to have. It's the yesterdays I no longer get to remember with them. It's the dreaming I no longer get to share with them. It's that sense of connection. How do you measure connection? How do you quantify connection with an individual? How do you say that's what's lost? These are the kinds of things that people, when they go through trauma, struggle to articulate. They don't have words for. And the simplicity of saying, well, they're gone, seems trite. And there's a deeper pain to it. So understanding that longing is not just about, the rape. It's not just about the loss of the loved one or the partner or whatever it might be. There's so many intangibles that are connected to that. And to be able to speak to those intangibles and to recognize that you lost a lot more than a partner that day. You lost a lot more than your canine buddy that day. You lost a lot more than that promotion that day. You lost the dreams of a different livelihood. You lost all these different kinds of things. Those are the things that people feel seen and connected with. The sense of safety of you understand. Even if you've never lost it, you understand. Because I will tell you, anybody in this room has been through some kind of trauma, some kind of longing. You know what it is to long for something. That little piece of understanding with the help of Jesus Christ to give the words to say, and you don't have to compare. It's not about comparing. It's simply saying, I know what it is for me to long for something. So to a small degree, I can understand what your pain might be like, because I know my longing, which goes back into, we can't give what we don't have. If we're not willing to go into our own pain and feel our own emotions and navigate our own healing process, we can't adequately come alongside those who are in pain, because we can't give them the comfort that they need if we have never received that kind of comfort. Right. And then the last one here, the sense of feeling lost. Another quote by Brene Brown: grief requires us to reorient ourselves to every part of our physical, emotional, and social worlds. When you go through a trauma, it changes you completely. It's not just a sense of, well, that was hard and that was bad. It it tries to completely twist around and reshape your entire identity. You lose who you are. And when you have that sense of loss, when your identity is strapped to a career or a job or a title or a position or a person, and when that's gone, there's this really significant sense of feeling lost. You have to redo life and reshape it, which is why we're going to get into how we can lose anything and everything and still not face that space of feeling lost. We're going to dive into that a little bit later. So with all of this stuff, all of this information, we have to start somewhere when it comes to helping people, and safety is that starting point. Safety. It's motivated by your love for them, right? But they're not going to see your love until they feel safe. And what that means basically is, once again, don't make it weird. I care about you is a form of love, right? You know, like I said, I love you. Some people might think that's really weird, but saying, look, I care about you. Care is a type of love. So if we care about someone and we want them to feel safe, we have to start with focusing on safety instead of focusing on making sure that they know that I care. For instance, if I'm sitting with someone and, okay, here's an example. I worked with a veteran who had some pretty severe trauma, shame, complex trauma. And then he had trauma in the Army. And then he came to me after he was out of the Army, and all the traumas were coming together. And he didn't trust women to save his life. I was shocked he chose me because we had a male counselor at the time. And I was sitting with him in the office, and I care about him and I want to help him and I want to work with him, right? But he was not giving me much of anything. I had to not focus on, look, I care about you. I'm here to help you. I could say those words, but they weren't really making a dent. What I had to focus on was, look, at any point when you're here, you can walk out that door. Anytime. Really? Yep, it's not locked. If you don't want to be here, you are welcome to leave. No hard feelings, nothing. And what did I just do? Kind of told him, I want to kick you out, but not really. It was, you have a choice. As soon as you don't want to be here, you are more than welcome to leave. And what I would do in every counseling session at the very beginning is I would give my little spiel and I would tell them, here's the thing. It is very, very important to me that you know you can tell me no. And they look at you like, seriously? I'm like, yeah. Because if I ask you something and you're not ready to talk about it, and you talk about it anyway, we got a problem, right? Because now you just got triggered because you didn't feel like you could say no. That's a problem. So you need to know that you can tell me no, and at any time I will respect it. I'm not ready to talk about that. Okay, we'll move on. I don't want to talk about that. Okay, we'll move on. I don't want to go there. Okay, no problem. You want to tell me about this? No. Okay. You want to talk about this? Okay. You want to sit here and stare at the floor? Yeah. Okay. It's your time. Do what you want to do. You know, you have a choice. And in them realizing they have the safety to make choices, they then felt cared about. Okay. Start with safety. Here's some signs that they don't feel safe. Should be pretty simple, but protection. They get defensive or avoidance, right? I don't want to talk to you. They're avoiding you. Guess what? They probably don't feel very safe, right? They get super defensive. Why do we defend ourselves? We feel like we're getting attacked. We don't feel safe, right? You don't need to be so defensive. What you're really saying is you should feel safe with me right now. Well, they don't. You know, we don't get to dictate that, and sometimes they don't get to either. We have to work to help them feel safe. Targeting, bullying, attacking, right? When they start becoming a jerk, that's another way they're trying to push people away. I don't feel safe from you, so I'm going to make you distance yourself from me. And once again, we avoid what is unsafe and we approach what gives us the perception of safety. We already talked about that a little bit. How do we get to safety? Silence is one big way to do it. Give them the space to just be. Okay, you don't have to stare at them. That's awkward. You know, if you're sitting with them like in a chaplain setting, or if you're in a teacher setting, or in a coaching or whatever it is, have some paper. Act like you're writing stuff down. Like, whenever you're ready, and you do your thing. You give them the space to think, to move, whatever. Speak to the body. Hey, I notice your hands are clenched there. Do you want to just open your hands for me? Just do this. We don't have to talk about anything, but let's just practice you just opening your hands. I don't want to. Okay, I'll practice. When you're ready, just relax your hands. We can literally sit here for however long you want and just relax your hands, right? And if it's in a more casual setting, let's say you're at a restaurant with them and just hanging out after hours, and you notice their foot starts bouncing really, really fast, right? They're just like doing this in their chair, moving over. Notice your legs having a bit of a spasm there. Do you want to go outside? You want to go for a walk? Again, making it light, not, are you feeling traumatized? Like, don't do that. That's not helpful, right? Or are you feeling safe right now? Sometimes that's appropriate. Most of the time it's going to make people go, yeah, why? You know, as they do a rabbit foot, as they're bouncing around, just, your leg's freaking out a little bit. Do you want to go for a walk? Yep, yes, I do. You give them an ounce way to speak to the body. Ask them what they need. Sounds super simple, but just ask. Sometimes they don't have a clue. Don't be surprised if that happens. Sometimes they do. Hey, what do you need? I need some air. Okay. I need to get out of here. Okay. Asking them what they need helps them realize that they have the safety, that their needs are going to get met. Needs are universal. Everybody has needs. And if they need something and their need is not going to be met, their safety is not present at all. They don't feel safe at all. But if you ask them what they need and they say it and you help them get it, you just establish trust, safety, and care in the relationship. You're eons above any counselor who tells them you need to face your fears. Time and place for that. But sometimes it's an apology. I'm not saying you've done something wrong, but simply, I'm really sorry you're feeling this way right now. This sucks. I'm really sorry you're hurting. I'm really sorry that you're feeling angry. Sometimes it is an apology. I'm sorry for how that came out. I can tell that was hurtful. I'm sorry that's how you experienced me. That was not my intention. Those are apologies that can help them see that you recognize that you had played a part in their current situation, however unintentionally. When we recognize the part we play in someone's pain, even if you're not the primary source of that pain, when we recognize our part in it, it helps them to realize that, okay, you actually are not trying to cause this. And you really do feel remorse for even the tiniest part you played. I tell people, it's like, imagine you got a blank wall and someone threw this giant thing of brown paint on the wall. Somebody else threw a bunch of red paint, someone else threw blue, someone else threw yellow, and you come up with a little green paintbrush and go, and someone comes screaming at you because of the green paint on the wall. And you're like, do you not see the mess behind my 14 green dots? You don't have to apologize for the whole wall. Just apologize for the little green dots that you put on it. Right? Own what's yours and leave everything else to everybody else. Another aspect of getting to safety, I really wish there were signs as clear as this one. Checkpoint ahead, be prepared to stop. We should really have those in people. Checkpoint ahead, be prepared to stop because you're going to hit a trigger, right? But there's not. So sometimes things like offering choices. Again, choices are huge. What do you want to do? Sometimes people need only two choices. Do you want to keep talking or do you want to stop talking? Do you want me to stay or do you want me to leave? Do you want to sit down or do you want to stand? Sometimes they need the structure of those two choices to help them manage themselves and yet still feel the freedom of choice. Sometimes simply, what do you need? What do you want to do? Sometimes that can be a little overwhelming because I don't know what my options are. Presenting options will help. Sharing observations. Don't tell them what they're doing in the sense of you're being a jerk. That's not helpful, right? That's a judgment call. You're raising your voice. No, I'm not. Your voice is at a louder decibel than it normally is. That's what I'm noticing. You sound upset. You sound angry. It's very different than you're upset, you're angry. Here's a key. If someone is expressing anger, anger is an umbrella emotion. Underneath it is fear, hurt, or powerlessness every time. If you think about it, you walk into a chief's office, fire chief's office, and you say, hey, we got a problem with Sergeant so-and-so. And I don't know what's going on, but he seems like he's going off the rails a little bit. He's out of control, da, 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 da. And the chief suddenly starts raging, starts getting angry at you for talking about so-and-so. You're just the messenger. You're sharing a concern. What is the problem? He's the chief. He's responsible for our officer so-and-so, right? Fear. What is happening to my squad, my team that I don't know about? And if he's going off the rails, what does that mean for when he gets on the truck? If he's going off the rails, what does that mean for how it's impacting all the other guys? If he's going off the rails, what does it mean for him and his future? If he's not okay, then what's going on? Hurt. How did I miss that? I'm hurt he didn't come and talk to me. I'm hurt he didn't trust me as his leader. I'm hurt that he's going through pain himself. I hurt for him. Powerlessness. What can I do? I got too much going on as a chief. I can't take care of this guy. I don't have the resources. I feel powerless to help the person I'm supposed to take care of. So if I get angry, I can act like the hurt doesn't exist. If I get angry, it makes me feel powerful, even though I am right now feeling powerless. And if I get angry, then the fear that I had, well, it's pretty much, I'm going to chase it away with my own anger. When you see anger come out of someone, check, could this be fear, hurt, or powerlessness? All right, so you sound, you look can address the underneath. When someone starts yelling, you look a little afraid. You'd be surprised when they get that flicker of, how the heck did you know? And then the defensiveness comes up. But empower, don't enable. So when someone says to you, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do. What are your options? Well, I don't know. Well, one option is you could do nothing. That's an option. Oh, I can't do that. Yeah, you could. You just don't want to, which is probably wise because the situation right now sucks. So what are your other options? You're empowering them to come up with their own solutions. They have the ability to do it. We can't hand people things. We have to let them know, empower them. You can provide the solution to this. You know this. And if they genuinely don't, like, well, what if you were to, let's say there's a situation, a conflict between two cops, right? And that one cop has to partner up with one of them and then jump in the squad car together, and they don't trust each other. They don't trust each other to have each other's backs. They don't trust each other to do the paperwork right. They do not trust each other. One of them comes to you and says, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm stuck. I can't do anything. That would be a horribly trapped feeling, right? Well, what are your options? Well, I don't know. I can't do anything. Well, what if you just went to the sergeant and asked for a different partner? Oh, well, then, and he's going to give you all these things. Okay. Can't go to the sergeant, or you don't want to go to the sergeant. You don't want to do that. Instead of can't, switch their words every time they say can't with won't. Watch what happens. Well, you won't do that. Okay. Or you don't want to do that. Okay. What else could you do? Eventually, their brain starts working. You give one or two options and they start seeing there are options, and they start looking for the other ones because they really do want to find a way out. So when you present an option or two and they realize there are some, they'll start looking for them and hunting for them. And when they find one, you may have already known it, you may not have. When they find one, they say, well, I could probably do that. Okay, go do it. You're not going to make that phone call. You're not going to talk to that person for them. You're going to encourage them to do it. They take ownership instead of feeling like they're stuck all the time. That's another way to help people to realize, even though you've gone through trauma and you feel powerless in every aspect of your life, here's one area you're not. You're now creating a new memory of a feeling of powerfulness that overrides the feeling of powerlessness. I'm not completely powerless. I'm not completely trapped, because there was this one situation with this cop I didn't want to work with, and I realized what I could do, and I did it. I was able to be a powerful person, right? All right. In addition to that, the reset. Sometimes people get into a space where they are not reachable. They're out, they're spiraling, they're gone. And sometimes it can look like a seizure-like thing and they can't move. Sometimes it can look like a rage. Sometimes it can look like a panic and just running. I actually had a situation like that today where I was helping a gal who needed to get some help, and she had this spiral moment where we were in a public place. She started to have a breakdown and crying, and she literally just in the middle of the conversation walked away. I'm like, oh, she's running. Okay. So I just slowly followed her from behind, and she went out of this public place into a more private place, and she was on the ground just sobbing into her hands. And it's like, okay, she needs a reset. So here's what happened. One, get their attention. And this can look like saying their name. So I was saying her name. This isn't her name. I'll use my name. I'll say, Sam, Sam, can you hear me? And in that moment, I knew she could hear me. And so she would nod, right? Sam, can you hear me? Need to get their attention. Then wait for recognition. A nod, eye contact, something like that. Then from there, establish connection, right? And then what that looks like is, can you look at me? Right? People can hear you and nod that they hear you, but still be completely here in their tunnel vision, unable to actually know what's going on. Can you look at me? Can you turn to me? Even if they shift their bodies some degrees toward you, but they're not looking at you yet, that's a connection. They're turning toward you instead of away from you. Remind them who you are. Sometimes when people spiral into a trauma response of feeling trapped and stuck, they forget who you are. Even if they know your name, they forget your intentions are not the same as the trauma intention they have in the back of their head. Right? I'm your friend. I'm just here to help. You know, I want to come alongside you. I want to support you. I'm here to help. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help. It might be an obvious thing, but there's something about the brain, about hearing those words, that helps to solidify a sense of safety. Provide them with options. Once again, what are your options? Or give them a 1-2 option. Remind them of your intention, which kind of goes into the reminding them who you are, right? Not your enemy. I'm here to help you. And invite them to try again later. If a conversation led to a spiral, when they get to a place of some kind of stability, be like, how about we just put this to rest for now, and we can revisit that conversation later. That's perfectly okay. If the spiral was as a result of something else and you happen to walk in on it, hey, how about we go for a walk? How about we get a cup of coffee? How about we do something different? Get their brain out of that trauma network into something different that's safer. And in doing so, and that could look like changing subjects, can look like going for a drive, going for a walk. I highly encourage walks because it makes the brain do bilateral stimulation. So you get emotion and logic going back and forth, and the brain gets more even keeled a lot quicker. With that, I'm gonna speed this up here. I'm falling behind. Boundaries, 2 separate kinds of boundaries. One is a police tape line. Anybody can cross that. And then the other one is barbed wire. Nobody can cross that, right? They're there for 2 very different intentions. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. In this scene, this was 9/11, and you see that there's a sheriff working there with the sheriff's department, a deputy working with the sheriff's department. You've got firemen, you've got police. Everybody had their role. Everybody stayed in their lane and did their job. Now, they came alongside each other. They were all pulling people out of the rubble. They were all helping out. But when it came time for the firemen to do the firemen's job, the firemen did their job. When it came time for the police job, the police did their job. They stayed in their lane. When working with people who have trauma, we have to remember what we're responsible for and what we're not. We are responsible for here's your list, your emotions, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, all these things. No matter what someone says to you or how they speak to you, you're still responsible for your behavior as a result. You choose how you respond. You choose how you're going to receive it. Someone calls you a name and freaks out, gets angry and yells and screams. You get to decide, am I going to let that get to me, or am I going to decide to believe that that's their issue they're wrestling with, and I just happen to be someone they're spouting out to? Actually isn't mine. Or am I going to react and take it personally? Our thoughts, not every thought is your thought. Just because a thought is there doesn't mean it has to stay there. We get to choose. Like I like to say, thoughts are like birds. You decide what's going to build a nest in your head and what has to keep on flying. You pick. Which means you're not responsible for others' emotions, beliefs, choices, etc. We are all individual human beings with the ability to choose. So when someone comes to you with need of help, or they're not coming to you, you notice it, and they choose to blow you off and stay in their trauma, that is their choice. Right? That's their choice. Now, we influence each other, but we're not responsible for each other's list, basically. All right, I mentioned before, how do we do this when it comes to seeing people? Are you you did this, or like if you are not okay, or is it that is not okay? This is a big thing here we're going to look at. When we speak to people and address people in their trauma, we have to remember their behavior is not who they are. My hope is that when I have a trauma response and a trigger and I yell or I shut down, that people will see through the behavior to my heart, right? My intention. Now, people tend to take advantage of that. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but basically being able to look through the behavior and see who someone is. Who are they? So where the identity perspective comes in. First and foremost, let's look at ourselves really quickly. Who I am. I go back to scripture because it is the one thing in the Bible that it's one thing in the world that has never been proven false, ever. It's the one concrete thing. If we stand on that and we live by that, everything that is promised in that book will come to fruition in our lives. I have yet to see that not be true. And I'm happy. I'm like, at any point, video or otherwise, someone finds out that's not true, I would love to have a conversation because I bet you I can prove you wrong. But so to start with, who am I? Genesis 1:26, I am made in God's image. You are made in God's image. This is true for everybody in the world. Essentially, if I were to hold a mirror up to your face and I say, is it you or is it an image of you that you see? What would it be? You, an image, right? An image of you. If I take that mirror and break it on the ground into 1,000 pieces and you look into that mirror, do you still see an image of you? Right? It's just broken, right? It's fractured. We are like the fractured mirror. God looks into us and sees a fractured picture of himself. That's what sin did to us. We're broken. And yet, Psalm 139:14 says we are fearfully and wonderfully made. As broken as we are still fearfully and wonderfully made. This is true for every single human being on the planet. Doesn't matter if you know Jesus or not. Every human is made in God's image. Every human is fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, for the rest of this, if you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, this is where it gets really fun. You're a new creation. The old man is gone and the new is here. We are dead. And every day we get the chance to wake up and live as though we are that new creation. We're continually on this process of getting rid of these old habits of living, these old dead habits, and putting on the new habits of living in Christ. It's a long process. It's a difficult process, but every day we wake up a new creation with the ability to walk that out. The stuff from yesterday, the sins from yesterday, gone in God's eyes. We're a new creation. It's one of my favorites. We're adopted. We all tend to live like the orphan on the street who's getting food out of a garbage can, is in the same dirty clothes, and sleeps in a doorway for shelter. That's how we live. And then Jesus comes to us and he says, I want to adopt you. I'm going to bring you into my family. And he takes us to a mansion. We've got a king size bed. We've got this gorgeous bathroom with a million different soaps and suds. We've got a closet full of clothes and this giant banquet table with a seat that has our name on it. And yet we never get out of our dirty rags. We don't go in the bathtub. We sleep on the floor, and then we sit under the table, if we even get in the kitchen, and we hope for the crumbs that fall from the table. We have to learn how to live like a daughter and a son, instead of living like an orphan like we're used to. We have to learn how to do that. And lastly, my favorite, we are God's handiwork and workmanship in Christ. Some versions like to say that we are his masterpiece. I love that personally. That's who you are. So, who is the person with trauma that you're dealing with? The one who shuts down, the one who screams, the one who, they are also made in God's image, fearfully and wonderfully made. They are a new creation, they are adopted, and they are God's handiwork. When we look through the behavior to the person, to the heart underneath, we can love them as Christ loves them, if we see ourselves in the same way. We have to love out of overflow. We have to abide in Christ to be able to abide with them, to remain with them in their pain. It's the only way we can do it. If you're numb to your own identity and pain, you have no ability to help the people around you know their identity. And on top of that, you won't even know if you're even doing harm because you're numb. I lived in that state for a very long time. We have to focus on our identity, who we are. We have to own our own pain. And then we can come alongside our loved one. We can come alongside our partners, our whoever we're working with, whatever, to help them see their identity and to help them through their pain. How did Christ love? We're almost finished here. I like to call it tit for tat. He gave his time. He loved with time, whether it was 5 minutes, 5 days, he loved with his time. He loved with intention. He didn't love everybody the same. Meaning the way he showed his love was not the same to everybody. And he spoke and lived truth. He lived it. He didn't just say it, he lived truth. And what did he expect from the people he connected with? That's the tat. He expected time. He expected their time. However, it's 30 seconds or whether it was 3 years, he needed their time. He wanted their attention. They had to give him their attention and they had to be willing to step into truth. So coming alongside people, we are called to do the same thing. We give them our time, we give them our intention, and we give them truth. And what we need from them is their time, their attention, and their willingness to step into truth. The love of Christ is literally the only thing that is strong enough to sustain us in the loving. Trust me, it does not work without it. All we do is we come alongside them to help them follow the same model. Finally, Jesus dealt with more trauma in his short life than we will ever deal with in our entire lifetime. He saw it, he felt it, and he held it all on the cross. We cannot expect to come alongside people, to love them and to care for them like he did if we don't do what he did. We have to rest. We have to have boundaries. We have to recognize what is ours and what is theirs and what is God's. If we're going to do it like, if we want to have the kind of influence Christ had, we have to be willing to do what Christ did and live like he did, which means we have to receive before we can give. Right?